Hello all, the Old Geek here, and today I'm going to be delving back in time to look at the first adventure I ever played. B3, The Palace of the Silver Princess. Now I don't have any of my basic D&D stuff anymore, so there's my copy of Labyrinth Lord, the nearest I've got to it, behind me. It was late 1983. My friend and I had both just discovered D&D. We had the Mensa Red Box Basic Edition, and I'd got the Expert set, which came with a copy of the Isle of Dread. But the Red Box version of Basic did not come with a module, so my friend went out and bought one. This one. Now I need to remove my nostalgic lenses and try to be objective. B3, to put it mildly, is infamous, steeped in controversy. Of course, at that time we were utterly oblivious to that fact when we rolled those dice in my friend's kitchen. But it would be remiss of me not to say a few words about the whole incident. Originally written by Gene Wells, The Palace of the Silver Princess was first published in 1980 and immediately recalled. The exact reasons for the recall have been the subject of debate ever since, and maybe we will never know the exact true facts, as this was over 40 years ago and people still argue about it. What is certain is that the artwork had a part to play in this, both in terms of its tone and its content. Some say certain people at TSR took offence at a piece of art showing new monsters called Ubus, with their faces being caricatures of their own. And if you look at that piece of artwork, it's possible, sort of. Others believe it was down to an overly sexual image of a young woman being bound by her hair and tortured by goblins. This was based on an encounter in the adventure. A quite frankly ridiculous encounter to have included in a module aimed at younger players, as Basic tended to be for the youngsters who were coming into the hobby, and AD&D tended to be for the more advanced, the more senior players. Also, you had to take into account the moral outrage that was festering in the USA at the time. Maybe it was both these images that caused the problem, but maybe something else contributed too, and I'll allude to what I think a bit later on. Whatever the truth of the matter was, the adventure was handed over to Tom Moldvay to rewrite. Some of the art was replaced, especially those two pieces, and the revised edition was released in 1981, and this time it actually made it to the shops. The original version of B3 had an orange cover, and if you are lucky enough to have a copy of that one, you can get a 4-figure sum for it. Such is its notoriety and its position as a collector's item. My friend's copy was, of course, the later one, the one with the green cover, and that's the one I'm focusing on in this review. Though I do have a PDF of the original orange cover version, as Wizards of the Coast had it available as a free download for a while. Presentation then. One of the pieces of artwork that was retained was the glorious cover image by Errol Otis. Clearly this is why my friend bought it. It is absolutely superb. It's one of my favourites. Inside, it is fairly obvious which pieces of art are new, as they are on the whole much better than the pieces inherited from the original version, which was, to put it mildly, extremely poor. This makes the module very uneven aesthetically. But Moldvay's text helps because it's always clear and concise. He writes well. And the maps, they serve the function. They are very much typical of the era in terms of their presentation. They work. So while the presentation is pretty average on the whole, it is far superior to that of the original, which was amateurish. So much so that I believe it will have contributed to the recall. It gave the impression of being rushed and unfinished, and I believe TSR's editors were actually told that they must not change any of Gene Wells' original work, and it shows. Now, that's only a rumour, but it looks as if the editors haven't even glanced at this. But back to the Green Edition. Tom Moldvay added a plot, a fantasy tale of a beautiful princess, her knight in shining armour, and a disaster. And as a result of that disaster, the town of Haven is in disarray, plagued by bands of humanoids. So the party have to go to the palace, find out what happened, sort it out, and save the land. Everything is caused by a cursed evil red gemstone called the Eye of Arik, and this is what is attracting evil to the area. Thus it must be destroyed in order to free the princess and bring joy back to the world. It's Dungeons and Disney. B3 is a dungeon crawl, a very traditional dungeon crawl. 2 levels of dungeon filled with monsters and loot, and some puzzles to solve in order to complete the quest. But they are very simple puzzles, as clues to their solutions are scattered all over the place. But there is an aspect of the adventure that makes it more difficult. The palace and its surroundings are bathed in a lethal red glow, which closes up behind the party once they have approached the entrance, and thus they cannot get back out in order to recuperate, which is a shame, because the place is absolutely stuffed with monsters. Unfortunately, this has been poorly thought out, probably due to Tom Moldvay having to hurry his own rewrite. The introduction to the module even talks about the party leaving the palace and returning to town to rest and heal between sorties. But the red glow makes this impossible. For them to have any hope of success, the DM will need to allow them to find somewhere safe within the palace, and also maybe award them XP and allow them to gain levels while in the adventure. Because when they go up to level 2, the encounters are, quite frankly, ridiculously tough for a fresh first level party. Never mind one that is wounded and devoid of spells. In addition to this mechanical issue, I feel some parts of the storyline are odd. Again, it feels a bit rushed and underdeveloped. Why would a lawful knight fly into town riding a white dragon? They're evil. And I would have liked to have seen a lot more made of Arik himself. He could have made for a much, well, not as a direct villain, because he's meant to be very powerful, but much more of his cult maybe within the palace. That would have been really interesting, but it's just not really there. There's just bits and pieces. As with the reissue, the original version also had problems with some encounters of wildly inappropriate difficulty. But at least that was more of a sandbox. The palace in that one was to be explored for exploration's sake, and the storyline was there more to just add flavour. The party were expected to be going to and from the palace. Thankfully, Tom Moldvay did provide a number of ways in which to deal with the Eye of Arik, and these are quite flavourful. He was not a module writer with a reputation for creating railroads, being better known for his pulp-inspired epics such as X1, B4 and X2, all of which gave the party a degree of freedom to roam. Okay, X2 had a mechanic similar to B3's Red Glow, but at least in that module the party were able to rest and recuperate very easily. Maybe his rewrite of B3 taught him this lesson. The original adventure followed on from B1 and B2 in attempting to be a teaching module. Various locations were left bare for the DM to stock themselves, and there was information regarding the overall region, giving ideas for developing wilderness adventures, politics and towns. The later version changed all of this. Every encounter was now fully detailed, and the wilderness section was entirely removed and replaced with an introductory chapter detailing the approach to the palace and the party's initial encounters in the first few rooms. This is presented in the style of a choose-your-own-adventure book, and while that sounds like it could be clumsy, it does all right. It does serve its purpose adequately in acclimatising a novice group with the general mechanics of the game. It is a shame that the wilderness section had to go, though, as that was one of the stronger bits of Gene Wells' original work. For the dungeon itself, Moldvay kept some of it, adapted or moved some areas, and created other parts of his own. Thankfully, he did keep two of the NPCs, Duchess and Candela, who bring some personality to proceedings. But even with the considerable module writing skill that he possessed, as X1, X2 and B4 were all outstanding, the final result with B3 is that it just feels like a monster menagerie, with a generic rescue the princess plot shoehorned into it. While some half-hearted attempt has been made to make it feel like a palace, it just doesn't. And by the time it was published, we already had two modules that did the whole learning module dungeon crawl so much better. I sort of wish that they'd focused on fixing the flaws with the Gene Wells version, give it proper editing, but generally leave the body of it intact. Yes, her original B3 was a mess. It was horribly presented, often nonsensical and badly written, but it also contained more spark. It was imaginative, and it had some scope for development by the DM. A perfect compromise between the two would have been if they had kept the wilderness and the storyline that formed the basis of the original, edited the original text properly, maybe removed some of the more idiotic encounters, as there were quite a few, particularly some of the new monsters, which were ridiculous. But if they retained its somewhat darker fantasy feel, that would have been great. Then we could have had one of the strongest products in the basic line. As it was, what we got was somewhat mediocre. I give the green cover version of B3 Palace of the Silver Princess 4.5 out of 10. It's not completely dreadful, but it's not exactly inspiring. Tom Moldvay would go on to do so much better. So much for nostalgia, eh? Well, at least 12-year-old me liked it. Otherwise I wouldn't have stuck with the hobby, so maybe it wasn't all that bad. I have always struggled with the idea that an heroic knight would fly into town on a white dragon, though. Well, that's been me, the Old Geek, with another old school module review. I do hope you've enjoyed it. Until the next one, see ya!